I am joined today by Katie Tolin, growth and profitability consultant for CPAs, an author, speaker, trainer, and founder of CPA Growth Guides. Katie is actively involved in the Association for Accounting Marketing. Welcome to the show, Katie.
Thanks for having me, John. I'm excited to be here.
Can you, just for listeners who may not be aware of who you are, can you give an overview of CPA Growth Guides and how you help accounting firms?
Sure. I help focus on growth from the strategy down. So a lot of times people think of marketing and, they operate at a tactical level. It used to be that you sat around a conference table and threw ideas out, or, we're going to throw out a dartboard and hope something sticks. And that's not the way it is today. It's actually, what are we strategically trying to do? And then I try to help connect the dots between the actions that firms take and the results that it's going to produce. So any professional service person has limited time and limited resources to market. Don't you want to make sure that the things that you're doing are most productive? So I try to help coach them through niche development, thought leadership, all of those fun things to make sure what they're doing is going to produce the results they're looking for.
Can you speak a little bit to your involvement with the Association of Accounting Marketing?
I joined the Association for Accounting Marketing my first month in an accounting firm. I remember my managing partner came to me. He goes, "We uncovered this group. Go join it." I was like, okay. The smartest move I've ever made in my entire career. So the Association for Accounting Marketing is a group of accounting growth-minded professionals. So we have marketers, business developers. We now have client experience people, even partners. So if your focus is on growth of a CPA firm, you're part of this organizations. Mainly we're United States and Canada, but we do have some international members as well. And I've, worked my way up. I started volunteering shortly after I joined the group. I worked my way onto the board. And then I'm still an active volunteer today. And what I try to do for the organization, a lot of my roles is providing content. What is the content we should be talking about? What are those hot button issues? And making sure that we're connecting that and bringing that to our members and to the wider accounting community.
And speaking of publishing content, it looks like the Amplify podcast started publishing content in 2017. I'm impressed that podcast is still active and publishing content 7 years later. That's kudos to you. You were actually among the first voices to appear on the podcast. Have you seen it grow and evolve over the past 7 years?
So I was part of the AAM leadership team that brought the podcasting concept. And way back then, this wasn't popular. Finding AAM members who could actually come together and knew what a podcast was and how you produced it and what it looked like was a challenge. But we got a good group together. And I remember, I think our very first podcast was done on-site video. And so you can see podcasting has changed as our strategy has as well. We've really moved from an occasional episode, because then we had no frequency with any sort of consistency. As a volunteer-led organization, it was like, oh, who can do it? Okay, well, I can do it in 2 weeks and I can do it in 2 months. And we kind of made that work. And we knew that today, that's not what podcasting is. So we've actually revamped the way that we do our podcast. And when we were talking about it, and we talked about some of the struggles that we had as an organization, but I think that professional services entities everywhere has, is time.
Yep.
How do you find the time to do this? How do you find the who you're going to talk to? How do you connect all of this? And early on, we tried to have one podcast host. Well, we had some turnover on our committees, and then that person was gone, and then our host was gone. And so then we started doing random podcast hosts. Well, when you ask for volunteers and you take them, you don't know how good they are. And so we're like, well, we need to rethink this strategy if we want to have any sort of good hosting. And so, that's when we came up with the concept of seasons. So rather than try to, and fail, which we did, try to do an episode every other week or to a month or whatever our frequency was, we were going to do everything in a season. So we were going to take a deep dive in a topic. And this is a direct relation to how we think people want to learn today. There might be one topic that you want, but if you want to know that topic, you want to know everything you can about that topic. So by moving to a season, the whole concept is we would have 5, 6, 7 episodes around a general theme. You can listen to any one of those and walk away with lots of great insights. Or if this is a topic that's incredibly important to you, like business development, you can listen to the entire season and take a much deeper dive into that content. And our thought was, If you record all the episodes in a season at once, you can have one host. There's consistency in that host because they've talked to everyone. They can weave everything together around that topic. And then that's a commitment that's more manageable than to do this monthly, quarterly, whatever frequency you want to do, that you can actually spread the wealth. So we can find 2 to 3 podcast hosts and actually do it more consistently. So I'm lucky that I get to be one of the hosts of those seasons. And it's always a great experience when I get to do it.
Yeah, I have a few different takeaways from that. So number one, well, first of all, for those listening, the theme for the most recent season that's out for the Amplify podcast is around business development. So there's an episode on comparing legal and CPA firms, business development between those two kinds of firms, managing a salesperson or a team, building a BD culture, how business developers work with marketing. These are all topics that, if you're interested in business development, check out the podcast. So that's a very interesting takeaway. The binge worthiness of it. So it's almost kind of like Netflix, right? You watch a show at night and then it's like, oh, you know what? That was really good. I want the next episode. And you're giving your listeners that ability to binge through at the speed that they want. They don't have to wait for a new episode to drop. So I really like that approach. And then the batching of the content, condensing those recording periods so that you have content that you can release. I'm curious, what is the topic of the next season of Amplify?
We're actually working on digital marketing. And so that's the whole concept, is to really bring different aspects of digital marketing together. And then we're going to wrap up with a case study of a firm who's actually going to walk you through what do they do when they get a lead in the door, and how does marketing qualify that lead all the way through handing it off to someone else in the organization.
Yeah, that's what I found in my experience podcasting, is when you have real life examples and stories, it's more valuable to listeners than some of the more prescriptive how-to content. So I'm glad that you're doing that and bringing in real examples.
I think that's something with the Association for Accounting Marketing that we hear all the time is we want to hear from our members. What are they doing and what are they doing well? Give us that, that real example. Not that we don't mind that philosophical big picture stuff, but sometimes we just want the nuts and bolts of how everything comes together. So that's what we try to do with the podcast, is we'll give you some of the bigger picture stuff and then try to wrap it up with something that's a little more hands-on, nuts and bolts, so you can understand how it all comes together.
Yeah, I like to think of those as like stories from the trenches. So you mentioned that you come up with like the topics, the speakers, the questions for each season to add consistency to the show. I'm curious, how is that going for you? I know that you mentioned the show's evolving. How is it evolving currently?
So we do have a committee that helps put everything out. So we get together as a committee, and AAM also has an editorial calendar on main themes that they want to cover per quarter of a year. So that's where we dive into it and say, well, what do we want to take from this content calendar and what we think would be valuable to our listeners? Well, we brainstorm on the call. We're lucky that we have some very smart accounting marketers on this committee. And so we get all the heads together. We come up with here's the theme, kind of like the digital marketing one. Here's what we think we should be talking about, and here's why. And then there's some initial brainstorming about what we could do and who might be a good guest. That's when I really go back and I try to put it all on paper. And I'm like, okay, session 1 is going to run X time, and we're going to have these potential guests, and here are the questions that we'd ask. So then I can bring it back to the committee and say, is this what we were envisioning? So from there, I kind of go out and I do the individual asks. We might have somebody else in the committee do the ask who has the stronger relationship with the potential guest. And then I just reach out and say, hey, would you be willing to do it? Here's the host. If it's not me, here's who your host is. And let's get something on the calendar to schedule it. And so, I think we're coming together with a process that's working a little bit better for us. As I've been part of this committee for a long time, it's a lot more functioning with some sort of frequency than we've ever had before. And, so it's great. And then, what we're doing and where we need to go next, though, is better promotion. So once again, we're a volunteer organization. So you've got your thing. You've got to get other people involved. So who's pushing that on social? That's another group of people. So what do we have to create for the social team to be able to push it out on social? And what do we have to do to get it on the blog? What do we have to do to get it in the member newsletters? So really figuring out what all those things are within the organization, as well as pushing it out to the podcast world to promote it to potential listeners.
It sounds like a very collaborative process. It sounds like you're faced with a few different unique challenges because you're running a podcast for an association, a group of volunteer members, as opposed to a firm where you may have more access to the resources internally. So it seems like that's posing a kind of a unique challenge.
It is. And I think, as we increase our listener and we're providing more value to people, we get a bigger piece of the budget. So, we've gone back and we said we need to outsource the production. If we want to have any sort of regular consistency to this, we can't leave it to a volunteer who suddenly has time to go put these episodes together and push them back. And so we were able to get budget dollars for that. Where the podcast that I did, and I did on business development, and I'm pretty savvy about this topic, I like to think, but I got off of each recording and was like, wow, we had smart people share incredibly smart stuff. And every time I did this, I was like, what are we doing with all this content? Like, there's a boatload of content out here. How do we, not every member listens, not everyone in the accounting industry listens. How do we get this out to more people in a format they might want it? And so, I, for giggles, took every episode I did and I transcribed them, uploaded in transcription service. Mm-hmm. We had over 48,000 words. I'm like, that's bigger than an ebook. Like, that's on your way to like a short book. So how do we do something with this? So I actually turned them all into blog posts where I said, here's what the takeaways from each of the audience members were. We're actually talking as an association on how do we turn this into something else, a checklist, a guide, an ebook, a whatever. Now that we have all this great content to get it in the hands of other people. And I think that's what's incredibly great about the podcast and just all the stuff that you learn is even when you have somebody who thinks that, I know some stuff, you don't. These really smart people or just good reminders of stuff maybe you need to know. That's and so how do you take that and get it out to the wider masses? And I think that's something podcasters everywhere struggle with.
Very cool. Well, I'm excited to see what happens with the next season, especially if it's about digital marketing. I'm curious, Katie, what kind of benefits have you seen personally being a podcast host?
I think it's just the conversation you get to have with the guest, because while you may know, or you think you know where the conversation is going to go and what they're going to say, you don't really. You know the theme, you know what it is, what we're talking about, and they'll share something and you're like, wow. And I always got paper in front of me because I got like two sides to it, like notes for myself, like, oh, great idea, I need to try that, and oh, bring that up and follow up. So to me, it's I love the personal challenge of talking to very smart people and learning from them and trying to pull a story out of them that others can learn from as well. I remember early in my marketing career, somebody said to me, they're like, Katie, you first have to be the student before you can be the teacher. And so I try to do that on the podcast. I try to be that student almost, pulling the information out of the guest and then, highlighting those things that I think are important to teach the listeners.
Thinking back on, you've been doing this for 7 years, this one podcast. Is there a moment that stands out to you that you will never forget? Maybe it's a guest, maybe it's a certain answer that you weren't expecting or a story that you weren't expecting. But what's one thing that really stands out to you from your time podcasting?
To me, the times that I love is when I have an opinion that the guest said. Like, I didn't have to share my opinion. I've been in this profession a long time. I think I have the right answer sometimes. And I'll ask a question and they'll say something. I'll be like, yes. Like, you know what I mean? Like, that was spot on. I couldn't have said it better myself. Like, those moments that happen, to me, I love those because, I think people want to do what's right, but they've got to hear it multiple times. And so when you can have consistency as in, oh, I heard this from this person and this person and this person, and all of that stuff really, really comes together. Like when I was doing business development and they're talking about things like, if you don't have clear plans in place about how commission is going to be paid, you're opening yourself up to a can of worms. And I'm like, seen it happen. Absolutely. Where there's, conflicts like, oh no, this is mine and this is mine. And I'm like, oh no, I was personally there. I get it. And so I love when those stories come out.
That kind of happened to me when you were talking about distribution, podcast distribution. Like that's something that I feel very passionate about because I feel like there are so many great podcasts in professional services that just don't really get the visibility that they deserve, quite honestly, because they're just not promoted effectively. And so I'm trying to change that. I'm trying to highlight different shows in professional services like Amplify. And then I'm also trying to kind of just broaden my own knowledge of, how other people are going about their shows, like how you go about the different seasons and launching 6 episodes at once so your listeners can binge episodes. I think that's a very, very interesting take on podcasting that maybe bucks the trend of having consistent publications.
Yeah, and really that was just meeting the needs of our volunteer base and how could we do this with the group that we had. And I think the other thing that we really had to give thought to, and I think anyone else doing a podcast does as well, is your audience.
Yes.
So, as a membership association, we have roughly 800 and some members. We do not have the full scope of what we think the entire accounting marketing universe looks like. But if there's only 800 and some members, I don't know what it is. We're not talking 50,000 people, And so we thought about who is this podcast for? And it ultimately comes back to, for marketers to be successful in their organization, they need to buy in at a higher level from the firm leadership. They have to understand that marketing is important. And part of our job is to educate them and give credibility to the marketers. So our podcast used to be very much AIM centered. It was all about us. And when we rebranded it, part of it was how do we make this apply to the wider accounting profession? 1, because they need to hear marketing. 2, it's going to add credibility to what each and every one of our members are doing. And how great would it be if one of our partners came to us and said, I listened to a podcast that talked about this. Are we doing that? That would be a great conversation to have. So, making sure if you're going to invest the time into putting this podcast, that you have the right audience that's helping you drive multiple goals outside of just listenership or conversion or whatever it is that you're looking for.
100%. If you're going to launch a podcast, lead generations, you're maybe a couple steps away from that, right? It's a great source of content. It's a great way to network with people. The extent to which marketers can connect the activities to business goals and outcomes, that is really what key stakeholders are looking for. They're looking for a compelling reason why they should invest in a certain marketing activity. And if marketers can get information from a podcast that can help them along their way, that's just solid gold right there.
For whatever reason, professional services wants to know that somebody else did it first and it worked.
Yeah.
Most of us are not on the cutting edge that want to be the first person to try anything out there. So to me, getting these stories and hearing them gives us that conversation piece to go back to our firm leadership and said, hey, on this podcast, so-and-so talked about how they did this. Yep. Guess what? We're not the first one. What I'm asking for is not crazy. Let's talk about how this is a good strategy for us.
But sometimes waiting and seeing what happens and then applying it, sometimes that's a better strategy anyway.
I think that as long as you're looking at it as, I don't want to do what somebody else does, but I want to learn from them and use it as inspiration to do it my own way.
Yes.
And I think a lot of times you have people that come to you and it's here's, it's like the keeping up with the Joneses. Here's what the Joneses are doing. We need to do this too. No, we don't. We need to be aware what others are doing to inform our own personal strategy.
That's exactly right. You don't need to launch the exact same podcast as someone else. Maybe you can launch one that works for your members or works better for your audience or fits better into your business or fits better into your personal workflows if you're a host that's strapped for time, right?
Yeah, I think the conversation is it really a podcast? Do you know what it takes? Are you willing to dedicate? Because what you listen to, okay, you had a 20, 30-minute podcast playing in your ears. You came into work this morning. It took more than that to put it together. Are you willing to invest in it? I think those are the conversations you need to have. And if it's not that, then what are you willing to invest time-wise, resource-wise? And let's figure out the best strategy that works within that framework.
Well, Katie, this has just been an absolute fantastic conversation. If folks that are listening to this right now, if they want to connect with you, where can they find you?
You can find me on LinkedIn, Katie Tolin, T as in Tom, Olin. It's a great place to find me.
Excellent. Well, everyone out there, connect with Katie on LinkedIn, and thanks for listening.